This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Cox, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Cox. If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you've come to the right place. Today's guest is Michael Cox. Now, before you hear from Michael, let me introduce him. He holds a PharmD and a master's in clinical research and trial methodology from Duke's University School of Medicine. And he's been in industry since 2006. And he has a really fascinating story of overcoming the odds and taking big risks. He's made a very positive name for himself in oncology drug development. For instance, he led the larotrectinib phase 1 study at Loxo Oncology. Also, he was the VP of Clinical Development at Day One Bio, and now he's the SVP and Head of Early Development at Circle Pharma. Now, on top of that, he's one of the most genuinely nice people you'll ever meet. Michael Cox, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thank you so much for the invite, Michael, and I'm super excited to be here today.
No problem. Let's dive right in. So your story starts at Amgen. Now, prior to that, you're a clinical fellow at the NIH, and then you get your first industry role in clinical operations. But then something happened. You pivoted your career from medical communications. Now, what spurred that change?
No, that's a great question, and it takes me back almost 20 years. It's hard to believe now, Michael. So I came in, as you mentioned, as a clinical fellow, and I was super excited to get a real job, to be paid more than what seemed like peanuts at the time, six-figure salary, and I was like, whoa, what is going on here? And I took a job that maybe I didn't fully understand. Clinical operations is really how to put in place a study, how to run a study from an operations perspective. It's not the clinical strategy. It's not really the taking care of patient part of the story. And really that's what my training was as a PharmD, right? I had general residency and oncology residency, and then 4 years at the NCI, taking care of patients. But I had a manager that actually could witness that while I was really good at that job, right? I'm a pharmacist by training, details, all of that. That wasn't one where my passion was, but two, it was not using my skills and my abilities to the best that it could be done. And so she actually realized that we had to do something. Otherwise, I would probably resign and I would probably leave Amgen. And so she started to set me up with folks around the company, PharmDs or pharmacist trained people, to learn about the different parts of industry. And so I spent about a year in clinical operations, which really helped me understand the industry side of running trials. But then I also started to reach out and find other people that were more like me and could offer me maybe a job that was still a challenge and be something more along with the skill set. And that's how I ended up in medical communications.
That's interesting. And I think that's a really important part of leadership. Someone who cared about you, saw a skill set in you, and then helped you grow. And that's such an important part of leadership, putting the right person in the right seat. And so it's nice that you had a leader like that. Now, after doing medical communications, I think it was for 6 years, most people would just stay in their swim lane. But you took a really big risk. Tell us about the move overseas.
Yeah, so I'd always wanted to live in Europe, and I don't really know why. My parents instilled this idea of travel and get outside of what you know and learn different things. We traveled all over the U.S. as kids. We had a travel trailer, and so I wanted to go to Europe. And in pharmacy school, it was really hard to do a semester or a year abroad because I would basically lose that year of education, right? Because pharmacy school in Europe and pharmacy school in the U.S. isn't quite the same. And so to get them to line up and basically taking a year off. And so I waited on that dream, and I received a phone call from a recruiter. Uh-oh. And they said, we have this job and we think you'd be great for it. It's with Merck. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm at Amgen. I can see Merck. And they're like, it's in Darmstadt, Germany. And I'm like, but Darmstadt, Germany? I'm like, Merck is in New Jersey. They're like, no, there's two Mercks and this is the original Merck. And so I went and I interviewed, and I liked what I saw. I liked the people I interviewed with, and a few months later, I jumped on a one-way flight to Germany, leaving LAX at about 10 o'clock in the evening. All my stuff had been packed up and moved over. I was hired as a local hire, not an expat. They were going to move me over, but if things didn't work out, I had to find my own way home. At the time, I was like, "Oh, you must speak German. It'll be fine." I'm like, "I know beer, Wiener Schnitzel, and Apfelstrudel." So I knew I could eat and drink, and the rest of it was sort of up in the air.
Wow, what a huge risk to take. I mean, and that's one of the, I think, nuggets for the leaders that are listening to this, because a lot of them will call me and say, how do I continue to move up? And one of the strategies is to take the risk that no one else will take. And it seemed like it really worked out for you. Now, were you leading a team at that time?
At the time, I was not, but I eventually did it. Within about 6 months, my manager that had brought me over ended up moving departments. And so I took over as the team lead there, really leading both global strategies outside of North America, and then leading global strategies, including North America, for various products. And it was, at the end of the day, it was an amazing experience, and it was a risk that, looking back on it, it was probably a little crazy to do. But at the time when I did it, I'm like, this sounds fun. It'll be great. And at the end of the day, I don't think I would change anything in my career at all, and specifically that move.
Oh, good. And I can see the way it's worked out, you wouldn't regret it. But when you're leading teams in the US, which you've done plenty, and then you're leading teams outside the US, there's got to be some cultural challenges and some cultural differences. What are the biggest leadership learnings that you can teach us from leading in the US to leading in Europe?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Michael. It was, I was coming in, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania and had worked for Amgen, right, a biotech in Southern California. And here you are in Germany, and leading a group, for the most part, German. There were other international folks at headquarters in Darmstadt, but it was really leading a group of Germans and leading a group of people who was working for arguably the oldest, it is the oldest chemical and pharmaceutical company in the world, but it's also still 75% owned by the Merck family. And there's a real sense of family within that, even at 10 or 15,000 employees. And so it was quickly learning and quickly paying attention to the fact that, Southern California cowboy biotech isn't going to resonate with a German family-owned business. And it was really learning that, sometimes decisions take time to be made, because that's the process. And you've got to, at one point I had a $2 million budget request, and I had to go to the family board to request the money for a medical affairs budget. Luckily, I didn't have to give the presentation in German. I could give it in English. But it's sort of in a little bit of ways, kind of Godfather-esque, of going to the family and getting buy-off from the family, and understanding. I think the other interesting thing with Merck and my time at Bayer, right? The pharma business is just one part of the conglomerate, right? At Merck, it's performance chemicals, and now with Merck Millipore, right? All lab equipment is right. Pharma is just a small part of the overall business. Sometimes I would joke the family may not even know that we're working on this, because they have so much other stuff to deal with from the perspective, right? I don't, how in tune are they with the pipeline that we're pushing forward? So, yeah, it's really understanding how you fit in with the group, and listening to what's out there, knowing that one way is not always the way.
That's a good nugget. Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., it seems like, at least in today's market, you have to lead through influence. What's it like leading an international team, especially Germans? Is there, if someone's listening that has that, a global responsibility, any nugget there for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things are still the same, right? It's influence, but it's much more trying to understand why people are doing what they're doing, right? In the U.S., people move jobs all the time, right? You know this specifically, right? Your job is to help somebody move to another job. In Europe, that's not necessarily a thing, right? People come and work for a company for their entire career for a lot of times, and it's sort of understanding that a different perspective, you can't shove that down their throats. You've got to help, you've got to influence them, you've got to lead them by example, you've got to help point out what this bigger picture is of how things are, because and a lot of times it's just, this is my job, this is what I'm going to do. It's a little frustrating at first when, especially Southern California, like, we're just going to go do this and it's going to work or it's not going to work, and if it doesn't work, we'll just figure it out. And I think one of the other big things, the German, the working with a bunch of German, is the sense of possibly failing, right? It may not be a positive outcome, and there's a lot to overcome that, to say, this is a risk, and it might not work, but if it does, here's what can happen.
Yeah, global leaders have to be aware of those cultural differences and the perspectives there for sure. And, every leader I interview, even before we started the podcast, they usually point to a time where they took a risk. And again, that risk propels them. Now that move overseas, that risk you took, positioned you to get the Loxo Oncology job to head up the larotrectinib phase 1 study. But that's not an opportunity that's generally afforded to PharmDs. But Jennifer Lowe saw something in you. Tell us about that experience.
Yes. So I think we mentioned at the top of the podcast that I trained at the NCI. I did my clinical fellowship at the NCI in Sandy Swain's metastatic breast cancer clinic. And I was the only man with a bunch of females, nurses and physicians in training and attending physicians. But that team understood that I was able to provide something, and I was able to learn, I was able to help, and I was able to run my own clinical trials. I needed somebody to sign off on my orders, right? And that person was Jennifer Lowe. She was my senior fellow when I was a junior fellow. And we stayed in contact with one another over the years. And as I mentioned, when I relocated to Europe, I had to find my own way back. I had to get my own job. I wasn't going to be moved back. I was at Bayer at the time. I had left German Merck to Bayer. And I was having lunch with Jennifer, as we did off and on at conferences. We were in Barcelona at the AACR NCI EORTC Molecular Targets meeting, and she had just moved from Genentech to Loxo Oncology as the CMO, and she started talking about what was going on at Loxo, and a couple of things sort of piqued my interest. And one of them was when I was in pharmacy school of mine, right? And this is the mid-90s. This is before Gleevec. This is before the Human Genome Project or the Cancer Genome Project. Why can't we just develop a pill taken once a day with no side effects that targets what's wrong with the tumor? And here I am speaking to Jennifer Lowe about what was to become larotrectinib, targeting track fusions, right? And I think at the time I didn't know what it was, but learned quickly thereafter. And Jennifer is looking at me of like, look, you've got this great medical affairs background. You've been in the U.S. You've been in Europe. You can build networks, but you've not been given the opportunity to lead the clinical development program, which I know you can do, but you're not ready to come back to the U.S. And I said, well, for the right opportunity, I think I could move back. And that's how we got there. And I think, as we know now, right, the hope and dream of what larotrectinib could be, right, targeting a fusion in multiple tumor types, being treated as the same disease. That was really a dream of mine and so many other people to do that, but we know it worked out, and I think that risk to a startup was probably one of my other major career highlights that I've had.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, because you worked at 3 stable companies, and then you go to this startup in a role you've never done before. I mean, my hat is off to Jennifer, because she said, I know you can do this. Empowering someone, I think, is a great leadership skill, even if they're going to be in a seat they've never been in. But what were some of your learnings from leaving big pharma, international pharma, to go into a startup setting?
Yeah. For any of your listeners that have ever done that, they sort of understand. And for your listeners that haven't done it, they're like, oh, that sounds fun. It is a lot of work. It is because, for example, if I want to talk to a statistician about trial design, right? When you're at Amgen or Merck or Bayer, there's a statistician you can pick up the phone and call, and you can have this conversation. You can design a trial. When you're at a startup, there's probably not a statistician. So you got to find a statistician. You got to execute a CDA confidentiality agreement with a statistician. Then you got to talk to the statistician. Then you have to do a consultancy agreement and get them set up in a billing process. And then you can finally have the conversation you want to have to design a clinical trial. So there's a lot of, if you drink the last cup of coffee, the only person that's going to make more is probably you or your colleague who's going to be mad at you because you drank the last cup of coffee and didn't make a new one. But, I think those people that have done it, and people like Josh Belinker, who was the founder for Loxo Oncology, and Jake Van Naarden, who was the chief business officer, right? It was sort of, making a cup of coffee or taking out the trash wasn't beneath any of us. It was a job that had to get done, as well as figure out how to, we always use the analogy, you're building the plane as you're flying it. And in a program like larotrectinib that took off as quickly as it did, I think, we joke sometimes that we were making up the playbook after we did the play, because we didn't really know what the play was going to be to make it up beforehand. So we did it, and then we went back and wrote the playbook. So but it's you've got to have this mentality that, if you need some pen and paper, like, you're gonna have to put in an order with Office Depot to get the pen and paper, to then draw out your study plans or to draw out your recruitment strategy.
Yeah, I hear you, and that's true. And what a nugget! If you drink the last cup of coffee, make more. There's nothing like servant leadership from there. All right, so January 2019 rolls around. Eli Lilly acquires Loxo Oncology. What is Michael Cox going to do? What's going through your mind at that point? What about your next career move?
Someone else asked me that once, and it was probably one of my saddest days at Loxo Oncology, and it was because we had done so much as a team to disrupt drug development, right? I led the adult phase 1. I led the pediatric development program. I would be invited to international conferences to talk what we did in conjunction with FDA on how we would partner. And it was so different that we had done. And my thought when we were acquired was that dream, that sort of spark, is it going to disappear, right? You always hear these stories of big pharma coming in and swallowing up little pharma. And are you going to take that spark away? I will give credit to Jake Van Naarden, who is now president of Lilly Oncology. And from what I can hear, at least the early phase development hasn't changed that much. The pediatrics has gone away a little bit. And I think that was always something that was going to happen. There's just less innovation in big pharma. But I will give credit to Jake for keeping that core team together and moving drugs forward. And so I think it came back to, what was I going to do next? And how was I going to get there? And as I mentioned, right, I led the pediatric development program and knew that there was this underlying push in the community, both in Europe, strongly in Europe and in the US, and really built on some coalitions that I had built at Loxo Oncology of pushing pediatric cancer research forward. Right, the statistic is about 7 years from the first adult being dosed with the new oncology agent before it gets into clinical trials for pediatrics. And at Loxo, it was about 18 months for us. It was about 8 months after the first patient with a tract fusion tumor responded. We were in the clinic in the pediatric trial.
Wow!
And I wanted to continue to push that forward and push that idea forward. And so I ended up at at a company called Day One Biopharmaceuticals that was really built on the idea of bringing pediatrics research as close to being in line with adults as we could. It was a new way of thinking, and a company that has really been built on that. And there are a couple other pediatric oncology focused companies at the moment as well. But Day One was a little unique in that the tagline was patients of all ages with cancer, right? Understanding that we have to have both adult and pediatrics together.
Yeah. So what a pediatric space is, I got to think, riddled with all different kinds of challenges. What are some of the unique challenges? If anyone's listening that is in the pediatric space or about to or wanting to, what are some of the obstacles that come with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of good ones, right? The before Loxo did it, there was the mentality that running a pediatric focused program before your adult program is licensed and on the market, if something bad happens in the pediatric program, you'll kill your adult program. And FDA has never been on record of saying that. And people have asked that question as I presented at these conferences. And Greg Riemann, who was head of pediatric oncology policy at FDA and has now left, would stand up and say, FDA has never said that. FDA would understand, if something happened in a pediatric disease that is not similar to an adult disease, wouldn't shut it down. I think there's other things like formulation, right? The youngest patient we treated on the larotrectinib trial was 14 days old. A 14-day-old or a 6-month-old or even a 2-year-old can't swallow a tablet. They can't swallow a pill, right? And it wasn't an injection, so we had to come up with a formulation we could treat a patient with that can swallow a liquid. And so there's work that has to be done for that. I think the other big thing, and this is what everybody will point to, is pediatric cancer in and of itself is an orphan disease, right? The number of total diagnoses a year comes nowhere close to probably the smallest population in an adult-sized tumor. And so there's little investment in it. There's, why are we going to push forward this indication to help a handful of children when we have a much bigger small cell lung cancer, for example. And I think historically, right, coming back to a startup sort of world, it's getting funding, right? Getting venture capital funding or investment bank funding for a pediatric focused development plan really wasn't there much before Loxo Oncology, or I'm sorry, before Day One Biopharmaceuticals. So, but I think it's those three things, right? The economics and then sort of the logistics of doing the trials.
But despite those challenges, we need to have these products. I mean, any parent will tell you, hey, if that's my kid, I mean, a 14-day-old child, imagine if there was nothing for that kid. That would be heartbreaking.
Right.
Well,
and I think that's the hurdle, right? That's the hard thing. And I think the hardest time of trying to explain that story is hearing the feedback of, well, there's no market there. Why would we do that? Why would Pfizer invest in pediatric research, right? Crizotinib is a great example of this. There's it was designed for patients with ALK-fusion lung tumors. ALK fusions were initially identified in a pediatric pediatric lymphoma. Okay. And it has since gone on to receive approval based on a study in another rare sarcoma that is driven by ALK fusions. And that approval came 10 years after the adult approval. Like, that is just, but again, it's transformative for these children, right? To come back to the larotrectinib story, we knew at Loxo Oncology, we knew that there was a pediatric disease driven by a TRK fusion. And so it's a tumor, maybe the size of maybe a ping pong ball or a tennis ball that is diagnosed sometimes in utero. And these kids, they could receive chemotherapy. It doesn't work very well, but most of these kids, because the tumor occurs in their arm or their leg, they end up with an amputation at 6 months of age. And so they'll grow up normal, normal without cancer, but they only have one arm or they only have one leg. Like you can't run a cross country meet or kick a soccer ball and run down the field with only one leg, right? It's trying to play baseball with only one arm. What to show was if you give this targeted therapy, you can shrink that tumor and they can go on and just have a minor surgical procedure and they're fine. And yeah, at the end of the day, Josh Belinker said, we have to go after these patients and we have to treat them no matter what.
Man, my heart goes out to those that are doing that. What a rewarding work, though. I mean, if you are saving children's lives and helping their quality of life thereafter, it's got to make you get up and want to do your job every day. And now, again,
it was anytime I would interview somebody, it was somebody I wanted to hire. I always close with if you want to change the world, come work for us. And a lot of people said, you know what? That's a closer. So there you go, Michael.
Yeah. Well, you're at it again.
No, it was great.
You're at it again. This new first-in-class precision therapy, head of early development at Circle Pharma. Now, this episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. But as you look back at your whole career, what is some advice, maybe some leadership advice, or even just giving some people some encouragement that are trying to move up the ladder? What would you say to someone in that position?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. There's have a dream and a desire for what you want to do, and don't take no for an answer, right? There's always a way to get to where you want to go. It might require you bashing your head against a wall for 3 or 4 years while you try to figure out where you're trying to figure out the open door to run through, but always have a hope and dream and a desire to where you want to go, right? And I think along with that, the only person that's going to watch out for your career is yourself. I think those are two big things. I live sort of this servant leadership mantra of empowering my team and hiring, right? My father was an electrician in the union and worked for a bunch of bosses and worked with a bunch of colleagues. And two pieces of advice he had given me was hire people that are smarter than you, that are going to be able to do what you need to have done. And the other piece of advice was when you're the boss, don't be the jerk. He actually used a different word, but I don't know if I can say that
Thank
other
you.
word
Thank you for
on the podcast. So we'll go with the jerk. It's like, empower your people to do what needs to be done, hire the smart people, and don't be the jerk. If you finish the last cup of coffee and your team's working till midnight because you're trying to submit something to the FDA, make another pot of coffee, right? It's sort of that. And then I think the other thing, and we touched on it a little bit, Michael, is leave the world a better place than you found it. And maybe take it a step further, a much better place, right? It's show encouragement for the people that work for you and with you, and be empathetic and understand that as much as you want work to be their number one thing, it isn't. Life happens in the background, but I think it's that of sort of have a drive and a desire and a push. Hire people smarter than you and let them do their work. Don't be a jerk and make your pot of coffee and be a human. And I think those are sort of my key takeaways and what I try to live my work life by and my personal life by.
It doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, anyone who meets you immediately realizes there's something special about you, and that has to permeate into your leadership style. It does not surprise me that you're a servant leader, very empathetic, and understand that work is just one element of a person's life. But I just want to thank you as we come to an end here. On behalf of everyone in the Pharmaverse, I appreciate your willingness to share your story, the risks, the challenges that you went through, and your insights. And you've given us a lot of good food for thought, especially around not pigeonholing certain people with certain degrees into certain functions. Because imagine if you would have never gotten that chance to lead oncology development because you're a PharmD. I mean, think how different things could have worked out, not only for you, but for patients. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.